Just to let you know, Margaret is here tonight because she's sick of me stalking her. No, I'm just kidding. The restraining order took care of that. Margaret is a well-known local chef, and I have absolutely loved her. These are actually my personal books, these two on the side here. Don't try and take them, please, because I will hunt you down. But back in the late 70s, when I would visit Mendocino County and Mendocino Coast, we would come for the Whale Festival, and I hold really fond memories. Every time we came, I made everybody, even the teenagers that groaned, I made them go to Cafe Beaujolais because the food was fantastic. The atmosphere was very homey and very welcome. And ever since then, I have strived to be a fraction of the wonderful cook that Margaret is. And she has, as he said, illustrious career. And I'm going to just turn it right over to Margaret. Margaret, thank you for coming and doing this. Welcome.
Hello, I'm really glad to see all of you, and I was really flattered when I was asked to do this presentation, and I have been spending a lot of time thinking about what I was going to say, and finally yesterday I thought I had everything worked out, and then last night I thought, oh no, I can't have this kind of a presentation and talk about my years at the Beaujolais without mentioning Stephanie Croninger, our graphic artist, who was a local, Jay Treesinger, who designed our garden, who's a local. And then I thought, oh God, I just have to start and give you this very spotty history because that's all this time period will allow for. However, I also thought that if you wanted me to talk later, we could just plan for an overnight and just keep there's enough food. I'm sure the librarians are really nice. We can just sort of move into that. But anyway, we'll figure that out at the end. So, as I said, this is a very spotty history. There just isn't enough time to tell every little thing. And actually, in researching this and going through my memorabilia box, I was flabbergasted at how much I had forgotten. And things that I was like, oh God, remember that. And I came across magazines and media, appearances in these magazines, some of which I brought, which don't even exist anymore. I realized, like, do you remember Family Circle? And here's McCall's when Michael Douglas was married to his first wife. That's how long ago, and how their marriage works, so it goes back quite a ways. But I don't want it, as I talk about this, to sound too smooth or too glossy or like a little tidy television show, because we've all now seen these shows that are streaming about, the difficulty, the drama of the restaurant business, the person who steps in, and the key moments, and there's like lots of highs and lots of lows. But then there's a resolution where it all kind of comes out happily ever after. There's a certain amount of charm here, a lot of character. I don't know if happily ever after is exactly how it winds up, but in any event, this is a talk about a restaurant that should have never succeeded. I shouldn't even be here right now. It should have happened. I should have bought it with some friends, and then in a month we could have easily been out of business. But you may know that statistics about restaurants always mention the fact that there is a high rate of failure and a very low rate of return. Usually restaurants go out of business. They say within 5 years. I think it can be faster than that. So the cards were pretty stacked against Cafe Beaujolais in general, but we also had some particular challenges that predicted doom. And one thing I want to say is I didn't start Cafe Beaujolais. I am frequently given the credit for being the founder, and that just isn't right. I don't know how that comes about, because it was opened by a family, the Pitzenbarger family, I think they came up in '68 and they actually opened it in '69. Jerry and Ellen. two other misguided people, and I put myself in that category also, who had a fantasy about moving to Mendocino from Berkeley and opened this restaurant. It was only open originally 2 nights a week. I was open all the time, begging people to come in. They somehow thought they were going to make it with 2 nights a week. I don't know, it's pretty hilarious. But it was legendary long before I came on the scene. They actually had a review by Caroline Bates in Gourmet magazine, which, you know, is kind of was at that time a pinnacle of an experience. She was very highly regarded. And as a matter of fact, their son, Eric, has just written a book called Beaujolais in My Blood. It's being, I don't know, officially published and put out into the world, I think, on Monday. But we got an advance copy. And it tells about, from his vantage point, everybody has their own perspective. But he was a tortured teenager who was yanked out of his high school to come up to Mendocino from Berkeley, if you can imagine this, along with his siblings. And he has some crazy stories, and also a picture of Mendocino, more as it was when I moved up here, which was really remote, very very empty, kind of, he uses the word melancholy. I think that word really sums up a lot of the feel. It's hard to imagine now, but it's true. And he's going to be here next month signing books at Kelly House. There'll be an interview and also a gallery bookshop on the 20th. But I moved up here in 1975, right after I graduated from UC Santa Cruz, with the intention that I would just be here for a few months to kind of recover from being in school for my whole life before going into graduate school and being in school for more of my life. And I just needed a break. I was supposed to work at a friend's cooking school in the Napa Valley, which fell apart at the last minute. And I ran to my dad, I was with my parents at that point, and saying, what am I going to do? Everybody else knows what they're going to do, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And my dad calmly said, why don't you go up to Mendocino? Your mom and I love it there. And they've got a bakery, I'm sure you could get a job. And I went, okay. And a friend of mine brought me up here. It was that simple. I knocked on doors all the way up from Elk. And this was right before Labor Day. People looked at me strangely, which I didn't quite understand until I actually got to Mendocino with all of these, no, we don't have a position. I was ready to do anything. I was ready to make beds. I didn't care. I just needed this break. And then when I got to Mendocino, somebody said, well, of course there aren't any jobs. It's because the tourist season ends on Labor Day, which is, you know, a week from now, and so there's not going to be anything. And I'm like, oh my God. But there was an opening at the Mendocino Hotel as a baker, which I had never baked professionally, and I didn't lie to get that job. I just didn't say everything. No, I have no idea how to turn that Hobart mixer on. I didn't say that. I said, what a beautiful Hobart mixer. And I got hired. And soon after I moved up here, my parents came to visit, and they took me to Cafe Beaujolais for dinner, which was a special thing. And we had a table in a room that ultimately became the room where our espresso machine was. And it was by the swinging doors, so I could peek into the kitchen, and I had a view of what was going on in the kitchen. And Billie Holiday was playing on the stereo, and it was all very kind of magical, and I looked into the kitchen. I had no real cooking experience at that point, except for my little silly stuff at the hotel. And I was mesmerized by what I saw, which was just people working. But for some reason, it really spoke to me, and I thought it was exciting. So at that point, I had no training except for the 9 months at the hotel, and I don't know if you could even put that in a professional category because I was earning $3.25 an hour. Of course, my rent was $180 a month, so it actually managed to cover it. But anyway, so friends and I bought the restaurant, and I had no training, and actually none of us had any training, to be quite honest. I think the friend of one of us worked at Chez Panisse, and we thought he was a much better cook than he actually turned out to be. One in a line of rude awakenings. But at that point, you know, Cafe Beaujolais is at the end of Ukiah Street, which seemed about 300 miles away from the middle of town back then. And nobody, you know, there weren't that many visitors. And people, I don't know what they did when they came to Mendocino, but they didn't roam all over the way they do right now. They sort of never went east of Lansing Street. And from the bank, you would look down Ukiah Street. Obvious nothing's going on there. So nobody even came down. And people would come and spend the weekend and then go back to the Bay Area. And a friend might say, oh, did you go to Cafe Beaujolais? I heard of that restaurant. And they'd go, what? Where? No, we've never even heard of it. And we would keep hearing these stories, and it was just, you know, heartbreaking for us that we had people who might have wanted to come who didn't even know how to find us. So even when had there been those people coming infrequently, which there weren't, there was still the matter of there just weren't very many people who lived here all the time. And you've got to have business to make a business work. You have to have, in the restaurant business, you have to have people coming in all the time. They have to be spending money. There needs to be a clientele. And so, you know, it was starting to be set up to be an impossible operation. But wait, there's more. And that is that we didn't really have any money. And so that fell into the seriously undercapitalized category. We had a little bit, we had enough, because the whole business along with the property was for sale, but of course things didn't cost like they cost now. So somehow we put all this together, and when I announced to my grandmother in Los Angeles that I had gone in on a restaurant, she, who was very positive most of the time, wailed and said, oh my God, and burst into tears. It was the only time I saw her cry in my life, and that was because of me. But regardless of all that, somehow Cafe Beaujolais did succeed. It has continued to succeed, and it's about to have like a 55th birthday. I mean, that's pretty amazing when you think of how far back that has gone. So the last evening of the Pitzenberger ownership was New Year's Eve, 1976, and we took over after that and seemed to spend an endless amount of time painting and cleaning. That restaurant was only open in the evening, and we were planning on being open during the day. And in the day, all the cobwebs and the funky stuff in the corners that all looked sort of elegant and sophisticated, all looked dirty and revolting, and we had to take everything down and clean everything. It took forever. Oh, and one thing I remember is some room, which became part of the dining room but wasn't originally, was absolutely filled with National Geographic magazines like this high, like a sort of almost a hoarding thing, and we could barely get through, and we had to take all these millions of pounds of magazines out and then take the old linoleum off the floor, and I remember buffing the wood floor underneath to get it, you know, to look nice, and yeah, it was kind of crazy. But in spite of all that, you know, we continued, and I was asked today to talk about my experiences as a chef, but you know, I'm not a chef. I don't consider myself anything other than a cook, and I come from a background that has, at least familially, very little to do with the way of anything professional with food. I was just brought up in a home where there was a tremendous appreciation of food. My mom did not know how to cook anything until she got married. And then, I don't know, she got a real bee in her bonnet and she decided, I want to go for it, maybe in part because that's what you're supposed to do when you get married. And she dove into the whole food world with curiosity and enthusiasm, and luckily for all of us, she had a tremendously good palate. And my dad was one of those classic could barely boil water, although he could make cornmeal mush. I do want to say that on his behalf, he could do that. but he was a huge appreciator, and his family was from Hungary, and the women in that family were amazing bakers. So he grew up with all of this really delicious, you know, strudels and pies and everything you could ever imagine. And he was very supportive of my mom and her forays into food. She told me when I was little, and I'd say, how can you make all this stuff? She said very, very sternly, if you can read, you can cook. And I thought, okay, I can't even imagine what she would have done with something like YouTube, where you actually could see this stuff, because that often was where I would get a little hung up, like, ooh, I want to make a Charlotte Russe, but I just don't exactly know what that would look like. Now, you know, you can see what something like that looks like, which is, I think, a huge help. I grew up in the East Bay, where food was just a part of the culture. I mean, there was so much fantastic food, I think in part because there was a very international group of people, thanks to UC Berkeley and the student body. The faculty came from all over the world, and of course we had San Francisco across the bay, and so international foods were just part and parcel of the culture down there. We had a lot of friends who came from different countries and all seemed to be great cooks, and we went to their houses and we had real Greek food and real Russian food and just, you know, loved all that kind of stuff. It was super fun. But at that same time, and so I'm talking about, I guess, the mid to late 60s, this is when everybody, whether they had any right to or not, was opening a food business. I mean, it was the most incredible time. There was, of course, Chez Panisse there, and they opened when I was still a teenager. And there was a little restaurant called The Swallow at the Pacific Film Archives, which was in the basement of the Berkeley Art Museum. And they had just wonderful, everything they had was wonderful. It was like this little cafeteria-esque restaurant, and open, lots of open space, and it just felt very, I don't know, sophisticated and fun, and like cool creative people were doing stuff. And one of the cool creative people was Ruth Reichel, who went on to be the LA Times and then New York Times food critic, and then went on to be the editor-in-chief at Gourmet magazine for many years until its demise. She will figure prominently in my future success. So, in that same neighborhood was the Cheese Board, which was the little tiniest business whose storefront was literally from this finger to that finger. That's how wide it was. And my sister and I had allergies, and we went to get allergy shots every week. And our pediatrician, thank goodness, was 2 blocks away from this part of Berkeley. And so my dad, who often took us in on Saturdays, always made it his business to stop, and we would, you know, go to get something from the Cheese Board, go to Pete's. You know, this whole neighborhood was very much a desirable destination for us. And so I remember once going into the Cheese Board. It had little teeny, I mean, the retail space could have been this big, and I'm not exaggerating. It was so tiny, and there was a counter with a not insane amount of cheeses, 2 people, and then there was a cooler, a refrigerator, right in back, just facing the customers. And on top of this cooler, one Saturday we went in, and there was a man playing a mandolin perched up on the top of this cooler. So there was this wonderful music, and there was this wonderful food, and there was just like, I don't know, kind of, it all just seemed so fun and intoxicating, and it made me feel like anything was possible. So that was, I'm going to blame that whole thing with however I got into this business. Pete's Coffee, by the way, which opened in 1966, was literally around that corner, and my dad went there. The first week it was opened, he was taken by a client of his who said, hey, this new coffee place just opened up, you want to go? Yeah, my dad said, and he became a complete Pete's fan from that point on. And so, you know, this was Like, do you have a sense of just how exciting it was? And we didn't even realize it. You know, we didn't have any idea of what would happen in the food world and how, well, certainly how much it would have something to do with my life. Meanwhile, my mom, who never in a million years would have thought of doing anything professionally in food, was still in the midst of being very excited about food, and it all was directed toward us, to our little family, my sister Emily, me, and my dad. And so she had, now I'm not going to call it a hoarding thing, but it was a rather bold amount of accumulation of food-related material. And so there were some towering piles of newspaper clippings. Those were a little scary by the kitchen table. They never went down, even though she insisted she filed them. And then there was this frightening tower of Sunset magazines from who knows how far back. And then, of course, cookbooks and stuff. But so we got Sunset magazine every month. We got Gourmet magazine every month. We got the Time Life Foods of the World cookbook series, which I don't know how many of you remember that, but I mean, I have to tell you, I still have imprinted in my head this picture of two Italian guys making mozzarella in a vat. And I just thought that was so neat. That was when I was about 17, I think. And then, of course, Julia Child was on the TV every Sunday night. We had this little funky black and white TV, and my sister and Mom and I were in a circle watching everything Julia was doing. My mom was taking notes, and sometimes my mom would stand up and run into the kitchen and make whatever she had just seen on the television. So, of course, back in those days, I think it was much more typical for families to eat together, and right on the stroke of 6, we all sat down. This recipe from such and such, you know, what do you think? And I have to say, I don't remember my mom making any bad food, but she was so consumed, I think, by this tremendous amount of recipes that she had, that we had to really be clever if we wanted to have a recipe made a second time, because she was just on to the next one. And my dad and sister and I developed, I think my sister and I talked about it more, but my dad came along for the ride. We developed this technique to kind of fool my mom into thinking that maybe the dish needed a little bit more work. And when she would say, well, how was it? And usually we were always saying it was great. We'd go, it's good. It could be, so there's something, I don't know, it could just be a little bit better. And she'd sit up and go, oh, and then we knew we were guaranteed to have that recipe one more time. And it wasn't for years and years later that we admitted this ruse to her, and she was stupefied. She actually never caught on to this. I know, isn't that amazing? It was just completely cracked me up. I remember one week, I don't know what was going on, but she made several nights of what we thought of as fancier fare, until I finally begged her to make something without a sauce. How often, you know, did moms cook like that for their family? But still, amidst that, all of that support and appreciation, I started to cook when I was about 9, and everybody was very encouraging of me. And I started with rice pudding and French toast, which were two of my father's favorite recipes. And one day, my dad brought home this book for me, and it's so wonderfully retro. It's just really, and it has the French toast in it. It's really good. I also sort of caught the baking bug. I discovered bread and yeast, and I just fell in love with it and made cakes and did I bring maybe I didn't bring the bread book with me, but I made a lot of things out of this poor Sunset, and this is the original recipe made from 1970, along with lots of notes, including a family meatloaf where I wrote, "Excellent, served with baked carrots." I just... Oh, here's the bread book. Here it is. This was my Sunset bread book, and I made a lot of these recipes, and they were really great. Oh yeah, and here croissant and all kinds of calculations and little notes. You have to be careful about this and that. Oh, my mom put a few notes in here too. Oh my God, so cute. So this was, it was probably what, 69 maybe, 1970. We used to sit around and talk about what it would be like to start our own restaurant. And never in a million years expecting that we would do anything like that. But everybody was starting restaurants, and they didn't have any training, and they all, had gone to school, and then they somehow careened over in this direction and had something to do with the food business. So we were like, oh, what would ours be like? And we decided that we would have a salad, bread, and soup restaurant that we named Leaf, Loaf, and Ladle. And anybody who wants to start that business can have that name. So when I bought the restaurant, there were 3 partners. I had 3 partners. And over time, I realized that we weren't the right fit. Somebody couldn't help us clean on the days we were closed because he was the waiter, and he had to be careful about how he looked. That's a quote, by the way. And another person didn't live locally, and so the other woman and I wound up, cleaning a lot of the time and doing stuff like that. And they just sort of started to fizzle out because I think it became pretty clear this was not all fun and games. So for some absolutely insane reason, my parents, who were so sensible, loaned me the money to buy these people out. And I just want to say I paid them back. I paid them back for every loan. They weren't the kind of people who were just like willy-nilly throwing money at me. And so that happened in 1979, and I thought, oh yeah, this is going to be so great. It's going to be so smooth from now on. But that was just in time for the gas crisis of '79 to hit, and nobody could get gas, nobody could afford gas, nobody came to Mendocino. I mean, nobody. And I had already launched plans for and publicity for this summer series of chefs, which included various Bay Area culinary people like Barbara Tropp and Marion Cunningham and other people, a different cook from Chiffonese and all kinds of people from that world. But what I'll never forget is this memory I had of Marion's weekend. And Marion was very famous. She worked with James Beard. She was associate of his forever. She did the 2 revisions of the Fanny Farmer cookbook. I mean, she was really well known. So if anybody was going to pull customers, it was going to be Marion. But I remember the Saturday night of her weekend, because people cooked 3 nights, there were 5 customers in the dining room, and I was one of them. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly how I kept going after that. It was really sobering, but I did have a lot of optimism and energy and a willingness to work hard, and I was really young, I think by that time I had invested enough time in it and had come to really love Mendocino. I was sort of bewitched by being in a small town, and there was a bit of a feeling that you could almost get away with doing anything up here. It was so quiet and non-urban, and everybody wasn't watching and reporting and all of this kind of stuff. I think it was also just a kinder and a gentler time, and a lot more forgiving, so I could indeed make mistakes, and people weren't on it in a second, ridiculing me, which frankly, that would have not been an inappropriate reaction to a lot of things that I did. But as remote as we were, we still took part in the whole California food scene, the Nouvelle California, fresh food and all that stuff. And we hired local friends who were accomplished gardeners, and they planted a garden that was a wonderful idea, and it turned out to be an enormous financial loss. So that was another mark against us. we opened with breakfast and lunch, in part because breakfast is my favorite meal, and because we could cook it. It was easy, and I like to bake, so we baked stuff too. Over the years, we developed a reputation, in part because few other restaurants took breakfast as seriously as we did. We were really in the forefront. I can lay claim to that. We were in the forefront of that. Let's do breakfast. It's a wonderful meal too. And we were still plagued by not having enough customers though. And since Mendocino wasn't a high-profile destination, there weren't very many visitors to the area still, and certainly still people were not wandering in that part of town. You know, we're talking 2 blocks away from the savings bank, you guys, but still, honestly. And so it wasn't like we got foot traffic the way you might in a more frequented place. Luckily, we had B&Bs like Joshua Grindle that had started right around that time, and they were so kind. They never yelled at me for calling for the 93rd week in a row, checking up on a Thursday or Friday about, are you going to be busy this weekend? Because I would assume if they were going to be busy that they would send people to us and we would be busy. They were very nice to us. So, you know, sometimes in the country, unexpected things happen, and we had a slow lunch day. And nobody was in the foyer, and there was a visitor who came in the form of a very large sheep. He had escaped from Barry and Heidi Cusick's property across the street and somehow wandered into the building up the steps, which I don't quite understand. But somebody rushed back in and said, there's a sheep in the foyer. And I had to go out and see it. And I don't mean it wasn't Mary Had a Little Lamb. It was a very big, a bona fide sheep. And it was just as confused as we were about what we were supposed to do next. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to turn a sheep around, but it is not that easy. Luckily, Heidi came and somehow talked sense into it and made it go away. But I used to joke that that during the rainy winter, and back then it was raining a lot, we lost less money being closed than being open. And to that end, we closed between 2 and 2.5 months at a time. We cleaned and we, you know, got some stuff together. But I also went to the Bay Area and I stayed at my parents'. I tried new restaurants, and because at that time I was working about 70 hours a week, I didn't have a lot of time for socializing, and so this was my time for socializing. So I got to show people that I was still alive, as they were saying, are you sure this is the business that you want to be in? No, I love it, I really love it. And over time, our breakfast caught on with locals. We sold our famous waffles and omelets and pancakes, buttermilk cinnamon coffee cake, which Peggy made and is back there, chicken apple sausages, and concoctions from our espresso machine. We had the first espresso machine in Mendocino. And I just ran into somebody recently who was sort of looking off into the sunset saying, remember the Cafe Fantasias and the roast aroma lattes? I'm like, yes. We opened an hour early on Mondays through Fridays, and we had an early bird special that was really directed toward, well, first of all, anybody, usually always locals who wanted to come in early, but toward like plumbers and carpenters and all those people who needed to be at work by 8. And so that afforded them the opportunity to do that. And I came across this menu. Oh. And on the back it says Cafe Beaujolais Breakfast Club with, we called it the Birdie. 2 eggs any style, crispy country fries, a choice of muffins, buttermilk coffee cake, or brickery toast, $3.25. And also, I had forgotten about this. We had, I don't know how many of you remember John Wetzler. He was a plumber, and I swear he lived at Cafe Beaujolais because we were in a very old building. And we finally, he was there all the time, and we named a breakfast special after him. One busy morning, things were humming along, and probably Linda Ronstadt was playing on the stereo. I loved her. And I was cooking, I was reading the tags, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a waitress rush through the kitchen and run upstairs. I thought, huh, that's interesting, what's going on? And then I heard a shriek. Okay, you never want to hear a shriek. To our horror, it turned out that the spigot on the 5-gallon tin of incredibly expensive maple syrup had been closed. Oh. And service had begun, and you know, you're busy, even if you're slow, you're busy with stuff, and she forgot. And so the container that collected the syrup had overflowed, and it had been overflowing for over half an hour. So the Beaujolais is in an 1893 farmhouse, unrestored, with gaps in the flooring, at least at that time. You know, it was like a funky old building. And so the syrup had been steadily flowing onto the floor and through the cracks between the floorboards to its destination, which was the dining room ceiling. And it started to drip, and we looked up, oh my God, no, this can't be happening, over a big table, not a little table in the corner where you could just go, okay, whatever. No, a major table. And when the dining room got warm, which it did every morning because we always had a fire, a roaring fire in the wood stove, it of course would drip faster. And we didn't know what to do, so we wound up pinning bright white to-go containers to the ceiling at the point of the worst drips. And this lasted for, I don't know, in my mind it's like 5 years. I'm sure it wasn't that long, but I don't know, when something like that spills, suddenly this much stuff covers the entire floor, you know? It just seemed like forever. So throughout all of this, the lack of money was still, that's the subplot of my whole life, really, in the food business. We reopened in February after these long vacations, and then it took 6 months, believe it or not, 6 months until August, the busiest month of the year, for us to get out of the red. We rejoiced during that period. It was so exciting. We could look at the profit loss statement. It looked very vibrant. We were like, yes, you know. And then every single year,
yeah.
And then business would go down because it was slower, October and November, and then we were back in the red again. So, you know, I look back, and now that I've been spending the past few days in this whirl of Cafe Beaujolais, I just marvel at how I didn't give up because the pressure was so intense. I mean, there's nothing like owing money and vendors being forgiving for a period of time until they're not, to really feel pressure. And it must have been around 1980, my sister was here visiting, and we were walking in the garden, I remember this very distinctly, and I was sharing my thoughts about selling. They seemed very logical, like I was making a case, this is why it really makes sense to, that, you know, this is not gonna work. And to my great surprise, rather than agreeing with my logic, she said something very matter-of-fact like, Meg, you can't do that. I was so stunned, and I know this sounds as improbable as when my dad said, why don't you go to Mendocino, they have a bakery there, and I just got in my friend's RV and we came up here, and that was, you know, beginning of the rest of my life. But that, I don't know, there was something about her encouragement and her support and her belief in me that where I just was like, okay, well, I will just continue, I guess. But it was still challenging every single day. And I think beyond youth and enthusiasm, I really boiled down a lot to just plain pig-headedness. I just refused to step away and see what I had done as having been a failure. I could not do that. I just couldn't do that. And I also couldn't believe that my hard work, which I set great store by, couldn't make us transcend all of these ridiculous problems like money and syrup dripping and all kinds of stuff like that. I think in part, you know, I got caught up in the dream, that dream that I warned you at the beginning, like don't think it's all smooth and glossy. And it wasn't smooth, it was just bumpy and really very rigorous and unbelievably demanding. But, you know, I felt the support of these loyal customers, people who came in every day. My staff really got it, what Cafe Beaujolais was all about. And they were in there working, and I thought that it was very important to do a good job for, on behalf of what I thought this little restaurant represented in our community and what it could become. So we received at that time little reviews. You know, people had funky, like mimeographed papers they sent out about, oh, go here and go there. We got these little mentions, and it was all very thrilling. But what made the real difference for us was in 1983, there was a double-page article by Ruth Reichel, that woman who worked at the Swallow, who went on to be the critic. She was the, I don't know exactly what, she was not solely the food critic, but they had a column called The Best of California. And we had the best breakfast in California, according to her. I knew nothing about her having been at the restaurant. She apparently had come in the winter. She had looked around, of course, in the winter, in the depth of winter, it was all locals. And she, I think, really got a kick out of how homey it felt and how the waitresses just recognized everybody and had ongoing conversations and brought them their drinks without even taking the order, because that was what the person got all the time. But I didn't know that this review was taking place. And the first I heard about it was when somebody called and tried to book the photographer who was coming up the next day. And I was like, wait, what photographer? And they said, well, for the California Magazine article. Okay, nobody told me word one about what this article, what was in it, whether it was positive or negative, but I kind of concluded they don't usually send a photographer if the story's bad. So this article came out, it was all copy on one side and a photo of me on the other in color. It was one of those, he was one of those hip photographers who was like, okay, baby, come over here. Okay, look like, so what he wanted me to do, and it took about 3 hours, he wanted me to flip the egg, and while the egg was flipping, look at him. It was a bit of a frustrating experience, but be that as it may, when the article hit, and I want to say it was in the spring sometime, it just created an explosion of business. It was like nothing. I mean, there's nothing like the printed word. And for any of you who can't remember what it was like before the internet, I just want to say the printed word, there was nothing like that. I mean, it was gospel when it came out. And people who came in all the time, some of our best customers, their parents were calling them going, have you ever heard of that restaurant? You know, they're like, Mom, we go there every day. So even my own parents suddenly started to feel and seem a little bit more impressed, and I think they were relieved that this wobbly business that they had been holding their breath about for all these years was starting to gain traction. I mean, it was pretty astounding. I was even impressed, I have to tell you. It was pretty crazy. So, what else did I want to show you? I wanted to show you something else here. Oh yeah, this. So this was a funny thing. This is a cookbook I got in October 1975. Interestingly, one of the desserts that Ellen Pitzenberger made that I loved so much was this, something I had never tasted anything like before, that she called Swiss broyage. And when I was looking in this book, I realized she got that recipe from this cookbook that I owned already. And so I actually had the secret the entire time, and I never even realized it. Just amazing. So, yeah, when I went through that tub of memorabilia, I came across some old recipes. One of these, I don't know if anybody remember, we had this format with this wonderful bird that Stephanie Croninger had designed, and I came across those. I came across some photos of me when I was 18 baking bread with a friend. There were notes about celebrities who had come to the restaurant, from Robert Redford to Johnny Carson to Jack LaLanne, who Howard over there waited on. We had Angela Lansbury when she did Murder, She Wrote, and you know, she brought up just unbelievable amount of celebrities in her age group. So there were some really, you know, revered people who ate at the restaurant. Julia Child and Julia Roberts, we had Joe Montana, we had Sandy Koufax. I mean, it was just like this cavalcade, and it was really fun. So over the years, people have asked me if I miss my restaurant, if I would like to have it back again. And I actually consider myself kind of a recovering restaurateur. It's a really hard life, and it takes its toll. My knees will easily tell that tale. 2023, I want it to be the way it was. So the answer for me is an easy no. I admit that. And I admire, you know, anybody who's in that business now, especially post-COVID. It's an incredible challenge. So these days, my hospitality involvement is in a different direction. I have a little Airbnb rental, and I get to take care of people that way. It's sweet, and I really like it. And what's really fun is when people, either when they're making their reservations or they come up and they tell me, well, you know, I came to your restaurant when you owned it. And then they'll tell me what they had and where they sat and who waited on them. And they might bring up a cookbook, or they might send me a photograph of their book with spatters all over their favorite recipes. You know, there's the black bean chili, and there's the Amazon chocolate cake, both of which Peggy made, by the way, and are both back there. In fact, kids who were fans, if you want to feel old, kids who were fans in the early days are now grandparents who have told me that my Amazon chocolate recipe has been their family's birthday cake for 3 generations. Wow. It's a legacy I'm very proud of. So I'm really lucky because I got to have a professional life where I have been able to do what I love, to make people happy, and to introduce them sometimes for the first time to Mendocino. And so it's just been very interesting, very demanding, and yeah, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you, ask me questions. Does anybody have any questions before I say anything about have at it with the food?
I have a question.
All right.
When did you sell the restaurant?
In 2000. Yeah, I know, unbelievably. I mean, it feels so long ago, but it was so funny just reading all this stuff. It was like it's been 2 days. Just really, really wild experience. Anyway, I encourage everybody to get their copy of Sally Schmitt's book. I met her many years ago when she was still in Napa Valley. She was a force to be reckoned with then. I think she was only on her 3rd kitchen of her 6 kitchens that she talks about. And a fantastic cook. She you know, so much is talked about farm to table. She really did farm to table. And it was sort of this organic outgrowth of everything she believed in and had been brought up to do, and what was possible in the Napa Valley at that time. It was very exciting. So the book is her voice. Yeah.
So how did you get connected up with Harvest Market? Because you did that for a while.
Yeah, I did that for 17 years.
Wow.
After Beaujolais, yeah. I didn't work for a few years, and I spent some time with my daughter and just, you know, hung out, kind of shaking and getting Tom and I gave a talk at for the study club, actually. We were both there. I can't remember what maybe it was 2 local people in the food business or something like that. And we didn't really know each other, but said hi. And then shortly thereafter, I got a phone call, and he invited me to come up, and he interviewed me, and he said, we'd like to offer you the job as the culinary director. And I said, oh, what's that? And he said, I don't know, we've never had one, you figured it out. And that's what I basically did for 17 years, I just figured it out. So that was a really great follow-up job to being behind the scenes for so long, because I got to use so much of my knowledge with the public, you know, and I love working with the public, so, yeah.
At Cafe Beaujolais, and then since then, how did you get fresh produce? Where was that drawn from over the years?
Well, you know, there was a certain amount of fresh produce that was brought by locals. There were a lot of farms, gardens. I mean, we had fabulous berries and lettuce and all kinds of stuff, but there were vendors. Oh, you know, Charles and Catherine, whose last name I can't remember, lived in Comchi, and we actually wound up getting a huge amount of our produce from them. And there were just some suppliers. I mean, there was like Ritz Food Service. I don't know if there must have been some kind of a produce vendor who we got stuff from, but we really tried to do it as locally as possible. That was fun and sometimes a little hair pulling. Like, you know, when you expect to get a couple flats of strawberries and then 6 little baskets come to you and you're like, what happened? They're like, the birds got it. You're like, okay. Yes?
How's the local restaurant scene for you now?
In terms of, do I enjoy it, or?
Yeah, do you go out, do you enjoy it, do you want something that isn't here already, you know?
Well, I cook a lot at home now. I just really, well, for one thing, I think COVID put the kibosh on a lot of going out for me. But yeah, I go out to Good Life, I go to Trillium, I go to Beaujolais. And the chef there, Julian, whose family bought the restaurant about 5 years ago, has a cookbook coming out next year also. So there's something about the Beaujolais, it just brings forth the literary in people, I guess. We go to Los Gallitos, go to Princess. I think that's where we go.
Ledford House.
Ledford House, we went to Ledford House recently, that was really lovely. Yeah. Yes?
What led to your getting a Michelin star? How did that process happen?
Did we have that when I owned it? We did? Really? I don't remember that. Huh, I don't know. Well, obviously I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. I don't. I forgot, to be quite honest, until this afternoon that article that Ruth wrote was in the Best of California. I forgot that we were called the best breakfast in California. I was just like, oh, she just wrote this article, and then I was like, oh my God, no, what was that? So it's amazing what you can forget. Yeah.
What's your favorite recipe of yours?
Well, I've been testing some because Julian, who is doing this cookbook that's coming out next year, has asked me to update, kind of tweak some of my favorite recipes, and he's going to include them in his book. So I have to say that coffee cake is so darn good. And I made a version that had berries, fresh berries in it, which I had never done before, and it was really lovely. So that was super good. And then I have to say, it's so funny because over the years, the recipes that people single out, well, they love the Amazon chocolate cake, that's back there too. But so many people have said, oh, that potato goop, I just love it. And so I thought, oh, the potato goop, yeah, I remember that recipe. And so I made it the other day, and it's just like shallots and butter and garlic and some herbs and olive oil and red potatoes, and you just bake it for a couple of hours. I swear it is one of the most delicious things I have ever eaten. Yeah, it's really good. Yes?
You want to talk about Julia Child's visit?
Oh, okay. So we learned that Julia Child was coming, and with her husband Paul and their friend Rosemary. And Rosemary was a friend of a good friend of mine. So we were tipped off. And so, you know, we knew she was coming. We had a couple days notice, and I was running around creating all these specials. I was making quiche. I was at the doula, you know, all these. Okay, so Julia comes in, the way she has, you know, she's 6 feet tall and stuff, and she was just like super down to earth, and she sat down with no fanfare whatsoever, and I thought, oh my God, what is she going to order? I hope she orders this special and that special. She ordered the black bean chili, which was the least expensive entree on the menu. And we were like, oh, the black bean chili? Really? Okay. And so she had it, she loved it. And afterward, everybody was asking, calling and coming by, what did Julia have? What did Julia have? Well, she had the black bean chili, and from that point on, for like 6 weeks, all we served was black bean chili. And I was like, couldn't she have picked a more expensive thing? Did she have to have the cheapest thing? But I just remember we were making boatloads of this chili. We just couldn't stop. It was hilarious. So if no one has any questions, please help yourself to this beautiful array of food that Peggy has created.
Thank you, Peggy.